This is the first in the series of Texts in the City. My name's Tony Wilson. I'm an author, 3 adult books and 5 for children. And I'm going to be hosting about half of the series this year. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the Wheeler Centre. I guess a few of you will be here hoping to improve on exam results, find that golden few percentage that will take you from sort of a 91 to a 98. And it's going to be a bit about that, but hopefully what these lectures and talks are going to be even more about is kind of engendering a love of texts and learning to think of these books as something other than a means to an end come November, but rather something that we can enjoy, part of the cultural heritage of Australia and of the world, and sort of hoping to generate a lifelong love of words and reading. To quote from none other than Maestro Keller himself, and if it's good enough for Goldsworthy not to attempt the accent, it's certainly good enough for me. Exams are a technical hurdle only, a chronological hurdle, a ticking of the clock, a sign that time is passing. And I think another one of the nice quotes in the book that we're about to discuss, no one wins by much. And we never lose, we only learn. And maybe that's a bit of perspective that applies in the brutal, grubby world of TERs as well. Having said that, both myself and our guests today will hopefully have that little bit that you can add on to what's being taught by English teachers and course guides over the course of the year. So, and we'll have questions at the end, and feel free to ask any sort of question at the end as well. But it is time to meet our special guest. Stephanie Trigg holds an honours degree and a PhD in English from the Department of English at the University of Melbourne, and a B.Lit degree in philosophy and social theory from Melbourne. She was awarded the University of Melbourne's Woodward Medal for Research Excellence in the Humanities and Social Sciences in 2004, and the Faculty of Arts Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2003. And in 2009, she was the Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2006, and in 2008 received the Patricia Grimshaw Award for Excellence in Mentoring, and that's an award for teaching excellence in arts and humanities from the ATLC. Ladies and gentlemen, she comes from a university that knocked me back from its creative writing program when I was in my second year of my undergraduate arts degree, but I'm no longer bitter. Please welcome Professor of English, Stephanie Trigg.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to be here.
Stephanie,
I'm glad you're not still carrying that scar, Tony. That would be a terrible thing, to carry one's imperfections into one's adult life, as the novel tells us.
Well, that will be one of the themes of the novel.
Sad.
And the gap between ambition and ability and all that sort of thing is something we're going to get to. But I thought I'd just quickly ask her, what do you do usually? What's your specialty area usually, and what's your favourite study area?
Mostly what I teach is medieval English literature. Really the work of Geoffrey Chaucer is one of my favourite things to work on. I'm also involved in a big research project on the history of emotions, so that's a much larger project. But I've also worked on Australian literature, and I've written a book on Gwen Harwood. Some of you might be looking at Gwen Harwood's poetry, so I've done some work in Australian literature as well.
And I presume the thing that draws you to a job like yours was originally a love of reading. Do you remember the sort of books that created this early on?
I used to read a lot of medieval fiction, medieval historical fiction, and then my elder sister was a great reader, so I was always reading books that were sort of really a bit too advanced for me, things that I didn't really understand when I was 15, 16, and then came back to reread them. And I guess that's what is part of the lovely thing about my job, is I get to reread texts. I'm sometimes reading things for the first time, but very often reading things again for the second, third, 10th, 12th time. And for me, that's the real joy about reading, the chance to go back and reread.
And you've reread this text, I think, over the last week, one that you read quite a few years ago. Did you love this?
I did. I found it just as hard to put down the second time as I had in the first instance. It's full of, we talk about unresolved sexual tension as a kind of a way that movies and television series keep generating interest. This book, it has its own unresolved sexual tension, but it has a number of other forms of unresolved tension that just keep you turning. And it's not so much about the great denouement of the plot. You're not going to find out, who murdered the body in the library. It's not that kind of tension, but it's about the tension of understanding the relationship between Paul Crabbe and Edward Keller.
I must confess, I started reading this and there was those kind of lurid descriptions of Darwin, and then they said he's got piano lessons, and I slapped my forehead and thought, oh, VCE English programmers, could you have thought of a more boring idea than this to set the kids onto? But then within a few pages, as you meet Keller, there was a transformation in my experience of reading this book. And there's something about, I think, the humour in those first few pages and the eccentricity of this character that sort of grabs you into the book. What for you is the initial drag of this book?
Well, I think when I first read it, you're right, it's the character of Edward Keller, who's just a really quite a mysterious character. I mean, he doesn't fit into the kind of the cliche of you know, the kind of the concentration camp survivor. He's much more urbane, he's much more, he seems a bit more reconciled with that history when we first meet him. But it becomes clearer and clearer that there are so many unresolved things about his past life, and so you keep, I find him an intriguing character. I find it hard to predict what he's going to say about Paul's playing. I find it hard to predict what kind of music he's going to like and how he's going to speak about the music. So for me, it is really the character. The first time I read it, it was the character of Keller. I agree with you. But now, when I'm reading it, picked it up over the weekend, my big confession is I have a 15-year-old son who's a pianist. So I was reading it in a very, very different kind of mind frame this last time, thinking much more about the nature of piano practice and how important it is to practice and what kind of future you can have as a musician. I was starting to think about I was thinking very much about Paul's parents and their wishes for their son to be a great musician. And I thought, oh, am I guilty of that with my own son? Trying to think about the kind of narcissism that can sometimes take hold of parents in their desires for their children to follow a particular path. So for me, I was reading it in the second time round with a completely different mindset from the mind that I brought to it the first time round. So there it's again, it's about rereading. You know, and once you've read the novel the first time and you know a certain amount of what's happened to Keller, then certainly when you're studying it, you have to go back and read it again, and you'll be able to read it with a different kind of attitude, perhaps a closer attitude to language the second time. The first time you're thinking, what's going to happen? The second time, how is it happening?
As someone who now is a bit immersed in the world of piano lessons and piano teaching, does it ring true to you? Does it feel as though this is a really well researched novel, like a really nice touch? And as a novelist, I'm always trying to think of ways of kind of making something come alive. And that detail that where he says you do not need your lazy little fifth finger. That might not be the lazy one, but obviously he doesn't have a fifth finger, and yet he seems to play just as well as. Is that true? Would you be able to play without a fifth finger? Do those sorts of things work for you?
I don't know. My son fell off his bike last year and broke his wrist, and he wasn't able to play at all. So, yeah. But you can also accommodate. I mean, he found that there are things that you can play. He had a big audition to do. He actually did it one-handedly. So the body can adapt amazingly to disability or to accident in that kind of way. I think what really rang true for me about the novel was the intimacy of a piano lesson, especially. I mean, I've been to a couple of my son's piano lessons, and they'll often be sitting next to somebody on the stool or sitting close to each other.
Do you take notes like Mr. Crab?
Oh, not quite as desperate. My piano days are well behind me. But there is something amazingly intimate about that. And those of you who have been studying music will know that experience and what an intimate thing it is. I mean, the teacher's body has to touch yours. They have to put their hand over yours. Or if you're playing the violin, they have to hold you. They have to correct your stance and so forth. It's an amazingly intimate situation. I think the novel captures that really well.
And what about, I guess, the music more generally? What it's trying to say about beauty, about romance, about love. There's that great quote about not trusting beauty. I think that's not the exact words of it, but. Do you think that for me there was real truth in that, and I think that maybe it's the heart of the novel.
I think it is the heart of the novel, but I think it's actually quite a complex heart of the novel. I think it would be quite difficult to say, you know, one sentence. What's the role of music in this novel? Because I think it varies tremendously, and I think the novel is not always entirely consistent about what it's saying about music. Too. I think I was thinking about this as I was coming down today. I think one of the things that music does, it provides a space or an opportunity or a site for people to define their own identity. And so it varies tremendously. So Paul is trying to find himself as a classical musician, but then for a moment in the school, it really suits him to become a rock musician. His parents love classical music, but the music they play is Gilbert and Sullivan. There are lots, and there's the rock music, then there's the jazz music. There's a lot of different forms of music in the novel, and it means something different to different people. And the other thing that's really, and you almost need to do a bit of listening to some classical music to get this clear, but the novel, it says sometimes one thing about the earlier music of Bach, Scarlatti, Mozart, and about later romantic music of Beethoven and the Russian composers and Wagner. And it seems to move a little bit between those two things. Sometimes Keller seems to be, and this is one of the great things that's when Crabbe goes to visit the cellist in Vienna, and they have this discussion, was it really Keller? Well, did he like Bach and Mozart, the earlier Baroque music and the classical music, or did he like the Romantics? And it seems that he has either changed or it's a different person. So there are lots of different forms of music, and it's not just classical music, but there is a bit of a disjunction between the earlier and the later romantic music. So if those terms, if you're writing on this novel and you're not really clear about the distinction between those different kinds of music, it's probably worth just doing a little bit of listening to listen to some Bach on the one hand and some Chopin on the other, just to hear the difference of those kinds of music.
It is interesting that something that's traditionally thought of as so beautiful, like, for example, Mozart, does kind of get painted in this book as the technical, mathematical style of playing. And in some ways, with the tragedy of his past, he seems to be gravitating towards that more technical, mathematical style of teaching as well, and to be eschewing the kind of romantic, more flamboyant. And you just get that little snippet where he's remembering his wife after the disaster of the Botanic Gardens outburst, when he's singing the song and remembering the romance again. And that's almost the big revelatory moment for Paul, that, wow, this man also has this ability, and listen to this thing that is so unbelievable. Did you find that odd? Because I never thought of Mozart as pedestrian and mathematical.
No, but it's very clear in the novel, especially around the discussion of having to play the children's Bach. I mean, those of you who've studied piano have probably played pieces from the children's Bach. You might at the same time want to go and read Helen Garner's book called The Children's Bach. This is another Australian author who's really also using that kind of music to sort of really to structure a fantastic novel. That's a great book. But yeah, so the Bach and Mozart are being used and taught as if they're very simple. They need to be mastered almost mathematically. And yet this seems to be the problem with Paul's playing, isn't it? That it becomes technically perfect, technically very good, but he doesn't play with enough passion. So then there's a real question in my mind about whether Keller is a great teacher or not, because if he's actually taught Paul to play with technical expertise and technical accuracy, he hasn't actually taught him to play with enough passion. And I guess that's one of the unresolved questions in the novel, whether it's actually possible to teach passion or not. And I just don't think there's any easy answer to that question. I think the novel doesn't resolve that either.
And which almost brings us to what I think is the theme that I had the most interest in. I've come from a background of football and desperately wanting to be in that top slither of a percentage that plays at the top professional level, and I kind of felt like I did everything to make that jump. And again, it's in writing as well, as you try and write novels or children's books, you're always sort of hoping that you're one of the ones that's actually good enough. And I thought that was the most compelling element of this book. There is a sense of doom, I guess, that Paul isn't going to make it. But at the same time, I didn't know that on the first read. There was that chance that 1975 was going to be about a glittering concert pianist career, even though it seemed unlikely. Yes, what were your thoughts on the whole question of talent and whether it's born or made and that sort of thing?
I think that's right. And when you're reading, you don't know from what position he's writing. He's writing clearly from an adult, looking back on his childhood or at least looking back on his adolescence. So you get that two voices, the things that he says and the things that he writes now about how he felt when he was younger. So you get that mixture. And you don't know for a long time whether he's writing from a position of great success or whether writing from a position of failure or writing from a position, as it turns out, just of good, mediocre. average. Very, very human. It's a very human position from which he's writing. And it's a bit, it's sad because you want him to triumph. You know, when you have a novel like this it's a mixture of a biography and an autobiography, but the reader, I think, really invests and identifies with the main characters, and you really want them to succeed. You know, you want Harry Potter to defeat Voldemort. You want to identify with the hero. You want success. You just don't get it. You know, what it turns out is that he's becoming a kind of a piano teacher, and it's a perfectly good profession. Most of us, and this is the sad thing about growing up, most of us are just going to be okay. We're not all going to be geniuses. We're not all going to be fabulous. We're probably just going to be able to, you know, if we're lucky, we'll be able to do our job well. And that's quite a hard lesson to learn as you get older. But as to go back to my son, the 15-year-old, he's a jazz pianist. He's been completely entranced, I was talking to Tony about this before, by a book by Matthew Syed called Bounce. And Matthew Syed has a theory that anybody, given the right basic circumstances, anybody can become very, very good at what they do if they put enough time and work and effort into it. So the classic cases are Mozart's father, who took Mozart when he was a boy around and taught him violin and taught him piano and really trained him up to be an excellent musician. Or another example is Richard Williams, who brought up Serena and Venus to be great tennis players. And Syed says, well, yes, you need certain circumstances and will, and it often does depend on the parents, you know, really pushing the child in that way, which is another whole question about what parents want for their children. But nevertheless, Syed says that if you spend enough hours doing something, you'll be able to get better. Now, those parents amongst us have been saying to our children for many, many years, yes, if you practice, you will become better. It's kind of like, you know, a bit blindingly obvious. But my son has had to discover this for himself. And so he now thinks he's not a very good musician. I think, of course, that he's wonderful because he's my son. He thinks he's only mediocre. But he thinks now that if he can practice enough, he can get good enough to be a jazz pianist, which is what he wants to do. So it's very enabling. It's a very enabling theory. It doesn't sufficiently account for the notion of genius, and in fact it's actually arguing against the notion of genius. It's arguing against the notion of a child prodigy. It's arguing against talent. It's actually quite a ruthless book. It says it's not about talent, it's about work and it's about practice and it's about dedication. So in a way, it could be actually quite enabling for people doing VCE exams and so forth. If you practice, if you spend enough time on it, you will be able to do well. It's an enabling book in that regard. But it demystifies the notion of talent and genius. And I'm honestly not sure what I think about that. It might be nice to have some discussion about that later, whether we actually believe in genius or talent, or whether we think it is about hard work and opportunity and occasion.
And I said this wasn't about doing well in exams, but my experience at university and at school was if you can do that thing that drags the text out of just being the text and looking at the wider issue in society, even if you're talking about something like every second person on Australian Idol saying, I worked so hard for this and I believed in myself so much that it just had to happen and has to happen, that there's this sense of inevitability about making it and about ability. Whereas there's this, what Keller says in this book that, you know, that really touched me, because I honestly don't think I could have worked any harder or wanted it any more to be a league footballer. But there's that day I realised that if I played on Dustin Fletcher my whole life, I would never get one single mark because I played a practice game on him. And there's that realisation
come on.
that you're just not good enough.
Yeah.
And I guess that this book, I think, tells the story of just not being good enough better and sadder than most books. It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
I think it's the real strength of the book.
Yeah, and it's tough. That's a hard lesson, isn't it? Because you are brought up to think, I can be anything, I can do anything. And if you think about it, especially those interviews that they have on American Idol in particular, people lining up to do their first audition, I believe I can do it, I've got it in me. And if they keep saying it as if it's going to come true without necessarily putting in the hard work, or without, you know, are they actually tone deaf or not? So it can be a delusional quality, can't it? You know, just saying it isn't enough to make it happen.
And regret in this book, I think, is really interesting as well, because adult Paul, looking back, seems to have this regret, and he looks at that key moment where he doesn't go to see Keller again. He chooses love and family over more practice and going back and starting Child's Mozart again.
Yeah. Or chooses sex over listening to Keller's story. He's about to get the mystery revealed, but Rosie's waiting for him in the car, and there's sex in the offing. So sex is the great distractor here. Yeah.
But in some ways, what more could Keller have done? What more could Paul have done as well? Like, it's not like Paul was a slacker in pursuing his dream, was it? That is a considerable effort.
He worked hard, and he sort of, this is the irony, that he seemed to me to internalise Keller's method, and yet that almost led him astray. You know, he internalised the method of, you know, playing with technical brilliance, but that wasn't enough to get him into the, you know, to win the competitions that were going to get the recording contracts. And Keller even says that about it himself, is, you know, playing is technically excellent, but you're not playing with enough passion. Yeah. And the same thing that his, you know, that the guy in Vienna says in the same way. But how do you teach that passion?
And that little bit's a lot, I think, is what they say, something much better than that.
Yeah.
What about Darwin? I've read so few books set in Darwin, and I think it's one of the strengths of the novel that it feels really fresh, because we've read so little about Darwin, and it's such a big part of it, you know, with the cyclone and just the whole smell and feel of the book and the heat. What were your thoughts on the significance of setting this in Darwin?
I think it kind of exacerbates the contrast between Austria and Vienna and Australia, because it's kind of an extreme case of Australian culture. The culture as portrayed in Darwin, it's very sensual. It's obviously very, very beautiful. I've never been there, but you can feel the beauty and the hotness, the humidity, the particular the being so far away from everywhere. So the discussion of the high school being the only high school for hundreds and hundreds of miles is fantastically is very powerful. So it's kind of like, if you've already gotten a contrast in Australia and Austria, it seems to be even exacerbated, made that a distance made greater by having it set in Darwin. And the idea, it's almost like a colonial outpost. And there are the parents performing these Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. And that's another thing you might want to do, is have a listen to some Gilbert and Sullivan. It's fun. Yeah.
And betrayal. I can imagine that a lot of people are going to, that betrayal is going to be something that's brought up over and over in this book, because of the parallel that's clearly there between the betrayal that is sort of lumped on Keller, if you believe it's betrayal, in relation to his family. And then there's that other betrayal of Benny, I think it is, the butterfly boy, by Paul.
Yeah.
My feeling reading that was that was kind of that you could overplay that this is a very different context, 1939 or 1938 Austria versus school playground.
Yes, I'm not entirely sure that parallel works all that well, because, as you say, it's so different. The stakes are so different. And in fact, also doesn't Benny say, I actually wanted you to tell that, you know, that it was me. So that put the dog turd on the thing, because he's actually spoiling for a fight, and that's not at all the same as Keller's response. And I think that to say those two things are the same in a way diminishes Keller's situation. I reckon
maybe what was closer was that desire to be liked. That clearly, or maybe Keller wasn't seeking to be liked, but to gain acceptance and perhaps safety. Maybe that's a stronger link, in the sense of going over to the bullies, becoming part of the rock band, because there was acceptance and safety in doing that.
Yeah.
That for me feels like a stronger link.
I agree too. And the idea that, you know, it's made quite clear in the novel that Keller kept playing for Hitler because he felt it would protect his wife and child. Now, in retrospect, we can see that as incredibly naive and not. It obviously didn't work. But I think that the novel shows us that when you're caught up in those events, it's actually very hard to see them from a distance. And that's why, I guess that's part of the way that the novel is structured. It is, you know, the adult Paul looking back, trying to see things, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, and also trying to reflect back on what it was like, in the 30s and 40s under Hitler.
What about weaknesses of the book? Is there anything that you didn't like?
I don't like the way Goldsworthy puts everything in capital letters. I know this is a very picky thing, but when you're reading it, he has a kind of a shorthand. So it's like, you know, when people are talking and they put everything in, you know, in inverted commas, on drawing attention to, oh, this is an odd phrase. Yeah. Goldsworthy has a kind of a little mannerism. So he puts phrases like, a big idea or a grand plan in capital letters. Once you start noticing it, it's on every second page, and it drives me crazy. I just want to go through as an editor and say, lowercase, lowercase. So that there's a kind of an impatience about the way he writes. Sometimes I felt he could have just slowed down a little bit more. He could have given us a little bit more reflective meditation on things. He could have put more verbs in his sentences. It's a little bit staccato, it's a little bit abbreviated for my tastes. And I think that this capitalisation, and he doesn't do it just in Maestro, he does it in his other work as well. But that's a very small thing. And I think it would have been, I guess that the dissatisfaction is part of the nature of this book, which is a book about music. So what I really want to do is I want to hear the music. That's impossible in fiction. The fact that you can't hear the music is it's a necessary evil in the book. It's like writing about paintings. It's when two art forms try and address each other. There's always a mismatch. There's never a complete. There can never be a complete meeting. And I think that's, for me, that's that gap between writing about music and I always want to hear the music and I can't always hear it.
Did you like the structure that had the kind of musical score, movements, kind of intermezzo and all that sort of thing? You
I like that because, I'm comfortable with that kind of vocabulary. I think if you don't know that vocabulary, it might even be a little bit confusing or a bit alienating.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The thing I thought was weakest about the book, and this is a small quibble, I really enjoyed this book, but I think the female love interests are both weak.
Oh, that is true.
Yeah, in the sense that they're really only sex objects. And I know that Goldsworthy would probably say that this was not going to be a book about the relationship that he wants.
About them, it's about me.
He wants the only relationship to really... he puts a spotlight on the major relationship of the book, which is Keller and Paul. And you could argue that if there was a proper love relationship between a man and a woman or two men or whatever, that would distract from that main... love, that main relationship, but I think that because there's only that sort of sexual element to these girls, it feels that they feel underwritten to me.
I think the girls are underwritten. That's absolutely true, and that's a kind of it's a version of the narcissism that I think that you see in Paul's character. That it's really, he accuses Megan of being narcissistic, of just seeing herself as a passive sexual object, but he himself is much more deeply narcissistic. And as a writer, the way that the character is written, it's also narcissistic in that regard. But what is really weird about the novel is if there is a good male-female relationship, it's actually Paul's parents who have a terrific relationship. But it's so weird that here is an adult male writing in the voice of a 15-year-old self thinking about his parents' sex life. That seems to me a bit of a false note. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think most people want to think about their parents' sex life at all. And for me, that's a slightly false note too. But in terms of how, male and female relationships, it's actually quite an interesting marriage.
Yeah.
They argue all the time, but they're also very harmonious. So, yeah.
The beauty point that we mentioned earlier, to be suspicious of beauty, I imagine it'll be something that students can say about he ends up being suspicious of the beauty, I think, of Megan, choosing perhaps the slightly at first meeting. I think his end up. What's the name of the girl? Rosie's maybe a little plainer, but the true love is there. And maybe sort of the more difficult beauty that Keller's trying to get him to appreciate in great music, he finds in this great woman. I wonder whether that will be an arguable point. No,
I think it's maybe that's right. But would Paul then do for Rosie what Keller thought he was doing for Mathilde? That's an interesting question. Yeah. Would he play for Hitler? Would we play for Hitler if we thought it was going to save our beloveds? And that's the moral question of the novel. And none of us knows what we would do under those circumstances. That's a really hard one, I think. Yeah.
And it's not a bad exercise when you're trying to work out what you think of characters, to write down the major decisions they make at different points in the book. And maybe we're about to go to questions, I think, in maybe just after. But how do you feel about Paul as a as a character, as a moral character? Do you come up with a positive view of Paul, or is he or both, I guess, which is usually in good novels, it's a both? It's
hard to do that. There is a kind of it's the novel. It's structured as a Bildungsroman, a kind of a novel about growing up, a rite of passage novel. That's true, and there is certainly growth. And at one point, he says he had finally stopped being self-centred enough, and he was actually able to listen. So he actually charts that. He tells you how he is growing up. Whether he really gets to a fully observed, fully realised human being at the end, maybe. I think the novel wants you to think that he is, but I think the novel is so full of it's a mixture of self-love and self-hatred, the way that he looks back on himself as an adolescent, isn't it? He talks about his own selfishness, and yet he also gives you the full picture. He explains exactly why he does everything. So you're being invited to identify with him at the same time as being told that he's selfish. So that's a hard balancing act to achieve. I guess there is a kind of redemption, and I guess there is a kind of a self-growth and a growth in self-knowledge at the end, but I certainly don't think that by the end of the novel you're thinking about Paul as a completely redeemed or realised character. No.
Yeah, I think there's that key scene, the awful scene of walking out on Keller as he's trying to tell him this thing, which I think is that is brutal, and there's nothing else in Paul's character that makes you think he is this brutal. And that's really the one that he has to somehow redeem that scene to come out as a redeemable character. But I guess I have an overall positive feeling towards Paul, and think he is very hard on himself, I guess. He's quite bitter about hard on himself on things that I personally wouldn't worry about. But then I'm also narcissistic. But we have time to 10 minutes of questions. We've got such a quiet and well-behaved and attentive audience. It may be that you've also got some questions that'd be great. And there's a microphone going around.
Paul says, almost the second last page, Keller was the worst possible teacher for me. He taught me perfection and then snatched it away. If Keller had taught Paul the Romantics, could Paul have ever become a great concert pianist?
That is a perfect hypothetical question, isn't it? I kind of think that the novel is saying that yes, he might, but that Keller has put so much of his own, he's let his own history stand so much in the way of that he's almost unwilling to teach the Romantics in that regard. And if you play Bach or Mozart with a romantic sensibility, you're certainly going to get a bit more of passion into it in that kind of way. So I think, cautiously, I would say, yeah, I think that's one of the things the novel is saying, that Keller holds back from that more expressive, passionate music, because he's afraid of the place that it's going to take him. Yeah.
I think he doesn't have that little bit. I think Keller calls it once, and it doesn't matter what Keller teaches him, and there's an understanding between both of them at the heart of the novel that Paul isn't good enough. And even though he tried to, I think there's a line that says, even though he tried to tell me so many times, he was not really listening, and maybe the parents weren't listening either. Another question?
You know how you said you asked everybody if they would play for Hitler? Would you actually go to that length to play for Hitler if your family was in danger?
It's impossible until you're there, but I would do anything for my son. Yeah.
And I think you can be coloured, and I don't think essays should turn into beautiful dissertations on what happened between 1933 and 1945 in Europe, but what people knew in 1938 versus what they knew in 1941 is probably a really relevant point, that you might still be trying to appease up until things became even more desperate. And I know that's. The historians would sit here and debate that all night, but it becomes a very different English essay if you sit there and try and picture whether the actual historical defensibility of Keller's actions, I reckon.
Yeah, and I think that here we probably make a distinction between what we are using literature for in an exam context or in a university context, and what we do with it in our own lives. I think there is a split, and I think that it's a good split because it's an impossible question. I mean, my gut says it's my son, I will do anything, but I also hope that well, perhaps I could persuade him by talking with him or something else.
And he is famous. Yeah. Like he's a big name in European music at the time, so that there would be that feeling that your fame will carry you through here.
And maybe that's the narcissism as well.
Yeah.
The believing that, if you're a great musician, if you're a great artist, then you have a different kind of responsibility, or you can have a different kind of impact on the world. Yeah. Or you'd have a chance. Yeah. No, that's true. It's a really tough question. Yeah.
Do you think Paul's satisfied with his life at the conclusion of the text?
Is he satisfied with life?
Is he satisfied with life at the conclusion of the text? What do you think, Stephanie?
Well, I think he wants us to believe that he is.
Yeah, I think that there seems to be genuine family happiness, and from my own perspective of trying to reconcile the things I've aimed for and kind of in inverted commas failed at, the thing that always, I think, is the consolation prize, or often is the consolation prize for people who are readjusting their gaze in terms of becoming a world figure. It is family that is the thing that allows you to readjust your gaze, and Paul is readjusting his gaze with a very happy, seemingly happy family environment around him.
And yet, this is the second last page. Now I was faced with myself for the first time. Paul Crabb, greying, dissatisfied, fast approaching midlife, my backside stuck fast to a minor chair in a minor music school. Then he talks about, yes, the redemption of family, and then the novel ends, as you know, with about this beautiful passage about nostalgia, how lovely it is to look back on that past. But at the second last page, we're still told that he's dissatisfied. Yeah. So I think that I'm not entirely convinced that he's fully reconciled, yeah.
You can also have professional dissatisfaction with personal happiness. So maybe he's talking only on a professional sense.
Maybe, yep. Yeah.
Do you think that the lack of growth and character development within the women is reflective of Paul's view of women, seeing as Maestro is supposed to be his memoir?
Yeah, it's hard to see any evidence for... I mean, except with his, discussion of his parents. I think it is hard to see any other way of thinking that he's just not interested. I mean, the women are there to reflect well on him, I think. And to fulfil sexual urge. I mean, that's how he first discovers his love for Rosie. It's actually a sexual thing. He doesn't like her at first because she likes him too much. So she doesn't, she kind of feeds his vanity, but he's, what's the word? He's kind of reluctant to fall for her because she's too needy somehow. So, but I think they're so thinly drawn, those women. It's hard to make a full judgment about it.
Because I think I'd give Paul the benefit of the doubt. I think that there were some reviews that said this if there's a criticism of this novel, it's too short. And I imagine that if there was more added, it might be in this very positive relationship he seems to have with Rosie, and that there is maybe respect there. It's just not shown in the book, and that might be a deliberate choice from Goldsworthy in order to kind of focus on this sexual awakening and this sort of luscious music, and that there's almost a poetic device in play to say, let's not deal with confusing off the main plot line relationships that draw extra character around this guy. Let's just focus on this one relationship, this major relationship, and allow everything else to kind of fit in with this lush, I hate using these, fecund or whatever. How do you say that word? Is that right? Fecund? The feel that you get from Darwin, that kind of tropical lushness that's almost reproductive. And that's almost how it seems to me that the male-female relationships that Paul has in the book are.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a kind of a parallelism at the end. So there is Paul, a music teacher, as Keller was, with a wife and a child whom he loves, as Keller did. So you're invited to think about those parallels and then to measure the Paul-Rosie relationship with the Edward-Matilde one. But you're not giving enough evidence and not giving enough material to work that parallel through.